And touching on the earlier point of starting your own Islamic bank account or engaging in an Islamic finance transaction, if you don't have an Islamic bank or any kind of means of Islamic financing, write a letter to your jurisdiction, write a letter to your local bank, your national bank, your government, requesting Islamic finance to come to your bank, city or country. We've, in the last 12 months, traveled from Canada, met with the government, Australia met with the government, and then governments in between. And alhamdulillah, even non-Muslim governments are actively pursuing an agenda of bringing Islamic finance into their countries. So seeing that there's a grassroots demand for it is going to further expedite that process, inshallah. And number 5, as Muslims, and as humans, we can consume less. We need to eliminate the need for things to the extent possible. Do you need 4 cars? Do you need 3 cars? Sometimes getting the groceries on a bicycle might help. Eliminate the need for some things. Reduce when you can, reuse when you can, and recycle when you can. But remember one thing, the law of thermodynamics is that even a photovoltaic cell for a solar panel requires an extraction process, a distribution process. It requires energy to create that. So whenever you do something that's consumption oriented, even if it's recycling, which does require an energy consuming process, you consume fossil fuels. So this is an awareness raising that we inshallah have to do, and I'm speaking to everyone, especially myself, because I am only just trying to implement these things, albeit slowly, and it's obviously very difficult, but this is part of, inshallah, the challenge and the reward of being a Muslim and being a human in these wonderful times, alhamdulillah. Recommended reading, there's very little to start off with, and we hope there's more. There's obviously more of you than there is of us, and certainly much more knowledge with you than with us, so we can offer this paltry little list for now. Debt in the Environment, an old but good book. Debt in the Environment, Convergent Crisis by Morris Miller, 1991. The Vanishing Face of Gaia, James Lovelock. That will give you probably one of the most prescient and timely overviews of where we're at, where we've been, and where things may likely head if things aren't done, if nothing is done about it. As you know, pre-industrial parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was 280 parts per million or less, and today it's 430 parts per million. And scientists around the world are saying when you go past 450, damage becomes irreversible. You pass a certain tipping point. So we're at that point now where we have to really ask the hard questions. So The Vanishing Face of Gaia certainly does that. And The Economics of Global Warming, which very much looks at present value discounting and interest as belligerents in the scheme of events. The Problem with Interest by Tariq al-Diwani's first chapter is excellent for anyone who has a desire to understand the more technical aspects of entropy, environment, the physical world, and how it impacts on an interest and how it impacts on the environment. And Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore, 2006. It's a good primer and a good introduction for people who are new to environmental causes. So we will close there and we'll start with questions. Again, as bankers, try to keep your questions focused on banking, and inshallah we'll go from there. So write your questions down and submit them. We'll try to answer them as fast as we can, but also as fully as we can. So Abdul Rahman asks, can you explain the difference between the two ways that interest creates unsustainability, debt payments versus fractional reserve banking? And Yusuf, our resident fractional reserve banking aficionado, will answer that one.
Wouldn't really say that, but well, basically this is, I mean, the whole point being that aside from all the things that Atif mentioned, there are bigger issues at play in the sense that the financial system we have in place itself encourages a growth or creates this idea of constant growth, which is not in proportion to the sustainability of the earth. And an example would be, is it Abdurrahman who asked the question? Yeah, Abdurrahman's question. Now what happens is that because banks can lend money over and above what they have, is at each point they lend money out. They lend money outside. They simultaneously create a debt for a depositor. So it's almost as if they're creating money. And there's an add-on effect by various banks lending an amount over and above what they have to keep in their reserves. So this is referred to as bank money, or broad money as opposed to narrow money. So banks, through the process of fractional reserve, literally create money in the economy. And what happens is when they create this loan, they then charge interest on the loan. Now the point is that this interest that has now been created doesn't actually exist, because as money it doesn't exist. And this is the whole point, because if we look at the history of fractional reserve banking, how it originated with goldsmiths, they were originally given gold for safekeeping, and they would give deposits out, and they gradually would give receipts out to cover the gold, and they gradually realized that people were trading in the receipts as opposed to using gold, and as a result they would issue more receipts than the amount of gold they were keeping. Now if they were to spend those receipts that they've issued on themselves, the chances are those receipts may come back to them at a later date for use in gold. And so they evolved this technique whereby they would lend the receipts out, and when the loans were paid off, they would cancel the receipts, so no one would know what they were doing. And in effect, by lending these receipts out, they would create a charge on it as interest, and they would pocket the interest. And this is still used today. So what happens is, by introducing interest on a loan through the modern banking system, a debt is created on society that doesn't exist. Now the question is, where is this money going to come from? Because if it doesn't exist, how is it going to come? And then there's two options. Either the bank will lend yet more money, or the bank has to have an additional supply of state money. Now, what was originally proposed in the UK at least as the best solution, and seems to have become the orthodox solution, was proposed by John Maynard Keynes. It's referred to as the Keynesian solution. And what he basically proposed was that banks would basically be facilitated by the central bank, which basically would its solution to monetary recession was to encourage this, was to be a risk-free borrower for the banks. So the banks in the situations of crisis could know that they could lend to the central banks with confidence, and then the banks would obviously reimburse the loans at a later date. And this obviously begs the question, why would the central bank do that? And the only reason is to sustain the system, because the central bank always has the ability to manufacture money for itself if it wanted to. Now, the fact that it does it to sustain the system creates what was in Keynes' idea obviously a solution, and it was a short-term solution, but it becomes a systemic crisis because the pattern is that of continuous monetary growth, and the money supply continues to expand, and the debt upon society continues to expand. And if we look at any traditional cultures, we would see that debt was something that was disliked. And if a system such as the modern-day financial system, which was allowed to operate in the manner it does through the fractional reserve system by the legalizing of interest, we will see that this system itself is constantly increasing debt, And just to give you an example, the UK money supply as of 1971 was £31 billion. At that point, President Nixon, through the Bretton Woods Agreement, closed the gold window, which meant that things were not pegged to the dollar anymore, and the dollar wasn't pegged to gold. What we see today is in excess of £1,700 billion. What's the implications of these last two figures? This means that every year since 1971, the banking system has created, on an average for its own use, in excess of 44 billion. 44 billion pounds. What that means is per year, the entire money supply, which had until 1971 sustained our economy since recorded history through the two world wars, is basically being replicated on a yearly basis by this money creation system. And we're wondering, how is the environment going to sustain this? Is it any wonder that the poorest countries are the countries that are responsible for deforestation, and so on and so on? So I seem to have gone on a bit because the other two people are giving me worried gestures.
Well, no, Yusuf, it's all very helpful. In fact, you answered two questions in one. Somebody else asked a question about how much, ANR asked a question, how much fiat money is responsible for environmental degradation. Can reverting to a gold standard help? So you definitely probably answered several people's questions regarding this. By the way, we will be picking up this conversation on our Facebook page. You'll get a full recording there. Just go to www.facebook.com/Ethica Institute, and please put your comments, recommendations, ideas, questions, book recommendations, and let's start a conversation and get a conversation going. We don't want this to be the first and last. Answering Omar's question, apart from the issues you've discussed in the presentation, and just to give you an idea, I'm going to answer, Yusuf and I are going to endeavor to answer at least 10 or 15 questions, and not more than 2 minutes per question, to give everyone a chance to answer.
That's a fractional reserve system. We can't operate on that basis.
Umar asks, apart from the issues you've discussed in the presentation, can the Islamic financial institutions be encouraged to adopt green technology in their transactions? The answer is obviously yes. Anybody can be asked to adopt a green technology, and the onus should be on Islamic financial institutions to lead the way. So yes, we hope. And this ties into another question, which is, I'm afraid, Saeed asks, I am afraid in the current Islamic banking industry, there is not a screening of eco-friendliness of projects it finances. Is there any stipulation or practice? Are there any standards set in this perspective? And I touched on this in point 5, which was that we do need to have these standards. We do need to have a sophistication of how Islamic finance and Islam in general interacts with the environment, and how we as followers of Islam and we as humans should interact with the environment. What are the rules? Because right now it's really anything goes, and our level of responsibility ends at the smokestack or the tailpipe. And nobody really cares because, air is free and water is free and we can do whatever we want. And really that's not the case. The case is quite different because it is a collective loss and a collective burden.
But I just want to say that actually Islamic finance as it stands now is not actually providing the solution. And that's important to say because the Islamic finance model as it's being implemented, when the scholars got together to try and decide how to provide a solution to, how to provide an alternative, they discussed things in terms of a paradigm shift. They discussed it from the top down, and they realized that we can't actually bring about an Islamic economy. We can't actually bring about this change because that would need change at level of regulation, that would need governmental change, and the countries, or the Muslim countries at the time, were not quite ready for it, as they don't seem now. And so what they proposed was, they said, well, let's chart a course, let's get things started, and hopefully when you reach critical mass, we will be in a position then to impact this change. Well, they started a course, and from 1970s they only had 1 or 2 banks, from 1980s they had other banks, and then they had a series of products that were developed. And from that point onwards, they've been operating within the same paradigm as conventional finance. Just as conventional finance is based on the idea of debt proliferation, on the idea of a fractional reserve, the Islamic model of banking have a whole proliferation of products that emulate the same thing from an economic perspective. And so Islamic banks operate within a fractional reserve system. They operate on a fiat currency basis. And as currently standing, the only real difference in terms of if you're looking at it from an environmental perspective, there are differences. But the only significant difference would be that there are ways in which we can say an Islamic bank is Islam in terms of not outwardly engaging in riba, but